Today at the National Press Club, Minister for Aged Care and Sport, Anika Wells. The youngest minister in the Albanese government, she'll discuss its ambition for aged care, outlining progress on the recommendations of the Royal Commission into aged care quality and safety. Anika Wells with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address. My name is David Crowe. I'm the Chief Political Correspondent at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age and a Director here at the Club. Our guest today is Anika Wells, the Minister for Aged Care and the Minister for Sport in the Federal Government, and the person who's responsible for a sector that requires about $34 billion of annual federal spending at a time of, I think it's fair to say, great pressure on aged care across Australia. Wells entered Parliament in 2019 when she won the federal seat of Lilly in Brisbane, her hometown. Famously a target at that time for the Coalition in the 2019 campaign, and she won that seat by, I think it's, by a narrow margin, 50.6% of the vote. At the last election last year, she then went on to gain a 9.9% swing, not something you see every day, in her favour, and she now holds it by 60.5% of the vote. So there's a political achievement. She is joined here by her mother, Deb Wells, who I'd like to welcome to the club. Thank you for being here. And of course, the family story goes that Deb Wells wasn't at all surprised when Anika Wells decided to run for the seat of Lilly. They'd known ever since Anika was in Year 3 at primary school and joined the rostrum public speaking contest that politics was probably going to be her fate. It's a time when the aged care sector faces immense challenges. It actually is the first speech to the National Press Club by a Minister for Aged Care ever. I found that surprising, but we've checked the history, and I think that highlights the attention that is now on aged care and the importance that everybody understands around that sector. For those of you watching at home, you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @PressClubAust and the hashtag is NPC. There's plenty to hear about from Anika Wells and plenty to ask her about, so please welcome her to the podium today.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the National Press Club for welcoming me to this first address in this venerable setting. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people here with us today. Together we stand on the shoulders of 1,600 generations of First Nations people, and in my first speech to Parliament almost 4 years ago, I dedicated my time here to being a good ancestor. And there is no greater contribution that any of us could hope to make than to care for, respect and value the generations that have come before us. It's difficult to reconcile that this is the first post-Royal Commission aged care address here at the National Press Club, when it is public policy that we will all experience in rolling incarnations throughout our lives. You may care for a loved one, a partner or a friend as they age. You may be the worker that provides care and dignity. Or you may be privileged enough to experience the quiet grace of ageing. How our nation provides for the final years of a citizen's life is worthy not only of dedication and of dollars, but of ambition. It's a challenge laid down for me by Royal Commissioner Linnell Briggs, who told me in one of my earliest meetings that aged care was mired in crisis due to a lack of ambition, due to a shrugging of the shoulders, a resigned sigh rather than a raised concern. And our government inherited a system that a Royal Commission characterised by a single word: neglect. A sector already at breaking point before the pandemic. A pandemic one provider called a daily war zone. The challenges we inherited were urgent and the system was flashing bright red. And for these past 12 months, I've felt the best we could do as a new government was to triage a crisis even worse than we feared. Today, I want to take you through what happened. And most importantly, I want to set out how measuring that progress to keep all of us accountable has brought aged care back from the brink. To set out how 12 months of urgent reform now gives us the capacity to face the future with ambition for aged care, and to set out how we plan to do that. We haven't come this far just to come this far. We seek to push forward where others pulled back. We embrace an era of unyielding honesty, because many of your mothers, your fathers and loved ones are frightened about entering residential facilities, and that hurts. I don't want Australians to be scared about the care that they will be provided in later life, and right now, many are. I don't want daughters and sons worried about the treatment that their parents will receive, and right now, many are. And like so many things neglected for so long, this will take time to deliver a system of care that we all deserve. The Royal Commission report described a point in time and urgent measures needed, and it set out a path for us to follow to repair a system in absolute crisis. And it laid out many aspects of reform that we have set in motion. It provided a strong foundation for what, in the end, took a new government elected with a mandate to end the neglect. So to remain focused on the future, I will not provide you with a full history of the aged care system. But where we are going does need some context, so I want to share two key features. The then Howard government introduced the current Aged Care Act in 1997. To take a trick from my friend and erudite senior colleague Mark Butler, here's a gentle reminder that 1997 was the year that crowds lined up outside theatres to see Jack and Rose fight to survive amongst the Titanic's wreckage. And the most popular TV shows in 1997 were Friends and ER and Seinfeld, now all considered retro. Double denim was cool. Times have changed, but we really are clinging on to some things from the 90s. And the Aged Care Act then, which is what it remains now, is focused on how providers run services. The legislation sets out the provider's obligations and responsibilities, and while critically important, this focus lost sight of the rights of older people. The Royal Commission describes a need for a clear statement that the care provided to residents is safe and of high quality. And this should be at the centre of everything that we do. And the Commission's report found more than 30% of aged care residents had experienced substandard care, found Australia's aged care workforce understaffed, underpaid and undertrained. And the Commission's report described the sector's management like this: those who run the aged care sector system do not seem to know about the nature and extent of substandard care and have made limited attempts to find out. I have sought to find out. I spent the first year going to every jurisdiction to understand the different models of care, needs of people in different locations, and the hopes and desires of older Australians in our system. I wanted to understand their ambition. And the final piece of this purposely short history lesson is that successive governments have invested significant resources into the system. So it was beyond regrettable coming into this role, my first ministerial role, to discover that despite the legislation being geared towards the obligations of providers, that in 2017, $2.5 billion was cut from the sector. And this saw the financial performance of aged care providers nosedive. Accountancy firm Stewart Brown noted that in 2017, homes had an average positive operating result of almost $10 per bed per day. Yet, by 2020, it was a loss of more than $8 per bed per day. Those cuts meant providers had less money to spend on care. Those cuts put pressure on staffing levels. Those cuts put pressure on quality. Those cuts put pressure on safety. So in just over a year, we have addressed 69 recommendations, almost half of the 148 listed. We inherited a system on the brink and at the cusp of another COVID winter, which meant the only approach was an urgent one. And with the Royal Commission as an ever-guiding present light to act and a burning need for urgency, we have embarked on more than 100 reform projects in the first 12 months. We have extended the Serious Incident Response Scheme to in-home care to make all care recipients safer. We've introduced 6 new quality indicators for residential aged care services to drive quality improvements. Worked with Minister Giles to create aged care labour agreements. Worked with Minister O'Connor on fee-free TAFE places and pathways, and worked with Minister O'Neill, a great friend who worked hard to bring aged care to such focus in the last term of Parliament to keep student visas for aged care. And that is just 5 of more than 100 reforms we are currently progressing. And some of our proudest achievements include star ratings, care minutes increases, the wages increase to workers funded as part of a $36 billion budget, and legislating having a registered nurse on site 24/7. And on some of these measures, we are flying, lifting a standard quicker than we could have hoped. And on some of these measures, we fall short. We learn the lessons and we try again. There is no doubt in my mind that every day I draw heat for striving for a higher standard is a day in office better spent than one at the margins, merely content to be avoiding scrutiny or neglect. For the first time in a decade, workers, residents, stakeholders have a reason to feel optimistic. The first aged care quarterly financial snapshot illustrates a major shift in financial performance. The first snapshot was based on the period 1 July 2022 to 30 September 2022. And that's important because it gives us a baseline before a number of the reforms, including the start of the new ANAC funding model, were introduced. And as you all know, it showed a residential aged care sector under huge strain, with 66% of providers making a loss. The second quarterly financial snapshot, which goes from October to December last year, is being published right now online. And you can access it on the department's website. The second snapshot provides the first insight under the new ANAC funding model that we introduced on 1 October 2022. And this latest snapshot reveals that by the end of December 2022, the first quarter of our reforms at work, the number of providers making a loss reduced from 66% to 54%. So our reforms are making a tangible difference to providers. And the latest data shows residential aged care providers delivered an improved average of 189 minutes of care per resident per day, moving closer towards the sector average of 200 care minutes, which becomes mandatory from 1 October 2023. We expect the next quarterly financial report for the period of January to March 2023 to continue the upwards viability trend. While from 1 July this year, residential aged care pricing will no longer be based on an outdated indexation factor that did not recognise actual costs. The former government increased funding for providers by just 1.7% in their last budget, and then spent the last 12 months watching that impact and discovering freshly awoken concern about the financial viability of the sector. We put in place independent expert advice, and then we followed it. This budget, our Labor budget, increases ANAC funding for providers by 17%, a tenfold increase. And we can also see strong improvement through the star ratings reforms we launched in December. Every quarter, Star Ratings provides an opportunity for homes to demonstrate improvements, and the first quarterly update shows the system is working. The freshly updated quarterly ratings reveal an extra 41 services lifted their standards to receive 4 or 5 stars. And crucially, safety and quality are improving. The number of services receiving just 1 or 2 stars has already reduced by more than a third in just these 5 months we have been tracking. Our ambition is working. Measuring is working. Keeping ourselves all accountable is working. And this, for the first time, allows us all to be optimistic for the sector and the increased care that residents are receiving. Now, we must also always seek, to deliver better care, and the recent tragedy in Cooma has reinforced the need to greater understand and support people with dementia. Dementia care needs to be core business in aged care. Over half of aged care residents, 54%, have dementia. And over 2/3 of aged care residents have some form of cognitive impairment. And this is why we are introducing new aged care quality standards as recommended by the Royal Commission. Outcome 2.9.6, under the second standard, requires an aged care provider to ensure all workers are regularly trained in relation to core matters such as caring for people living with dementia. We are also drafting Australia's new 10-year National Dementia Action Plan. The plan will provide a nationally coordinated approach to improve outcomes for people living with dementia, their families and carers, across all stages from prevention to care. It has been a difficult time to have a loved one in aged care, and that further demonstrates the pressing need for structural reform. Furthers the need to make the aged care equitable, sustainable and trusted as a system. That requires vision and clarity. This is our reform roadmap. You don't need to try and take notes. This will be published on the department's website. This reform roadmap provides our high-level plan to help everyone in this room understand and communicate the positive actions underway. You have been calling for it. I have listened. We have delivered. Our plan places older people at the heart of all we do. We are seeking to introduce the new Aged Care Act in 2024. That will deliver on 24 Royal Commission recommendations. That timing is intentional, as we want to be able to phase in anything that may come from the Aged Care Task Force. The new Support at Home program will then commence from 1 July 2025, delivering a further 21 Royal Commission recommendations. With good reason, replacing aged care legislation was the very first recommendation of the Royal Commission. And as I mentioned earlier, the 1997 Aged Care Act was put in place with the primary purpose of funding aged care providers. Our new Act is going to put older people and the services that they need front and centre. The 1997 Howard-era Act relies on the corporation's power. Our new Act will be underpinned by the relevant international conventions. And this shift to a rights basis is significant. The cornerstone of the new Act is going to be a statement of rights. Rights that need to be heard and observed. An approach overdue in this sector. But still, with that record of urgent action and investment, with all the hours of painstaking work, with all that we have achieved, I am still saying we have not been able to lift out of triage and prepare for an ambitious future for aged care. But that changes today. Being ambitious means being clear-eyed, not just about the scale of the crisis we inherited, but the challenges ahead. We must act now. The baby boomers are coming. Within a decade, our nation will have, for the first time in history, more people aged over 65 than under 18. And our workforce will be ageing, with people aged from 15 to 64 years predicted to decline as a proportion of total population. We have already heard the next generation of people entering aged care are going to want a different model and standard of care than those before them. There will be greater pressures on the entire community. And we must be innovative to address this challenge, and we need a funding model that is sustainable. We are going to need a fair and equitable system to meet the needs of baby boomers who, with their numbers and their determination to solve problems, have shaken every single system they have ever come across. They rightfully believe aged care can offer much more than it has. And we know that those people choosing residential care is trending down as the desire to stay and age at home trends upwards. It's why we must reevaluate the funding going into a system asking for more funding. The Royal Commission heard from 641 witnesses across 2 years. But the Commission's great unanswered question of the final report remains: how to make aged care equitable and sustainable into the future. The Commissioners couldn't agree on a prescriptive pathway forward. We need to agree on this now. We have heard calls from across the sector to review this funding arrangement and to take a new approach. We're doing this in an open and transparent way, and we will do this in conversation with the public, with the discussions driven by experts. Today, I am releasing the terms of reference and announcing the membership of the Aged Care Task Force. I will chair this task force that has yet another ambitious task: reporting by the end of the year and advising the Albanese government on options. We must modernise a Byzantine system to be future-facing. The task force members have expertise in economics, finance, public policy, ageing and aged care, First Nations and consumer advocacy and provider advocacy. And there is a strong focus on the consumer voice, and given this work is intended to support future generations as they move into aged care, the membership also includes a young economist with a strong interest in intergenerational issues and inequality. I want to publicly welcome the following members, some of whom are in the audience today and will be familiar to many of you, that will be joining me on this ambitious journey. Nigel Ray, PSM, will be my Deputy Chair. Rosemary Huxtable, PSM, who's with us, Professor Tom Calmer, AO, who is with us, Pat Sparrow, who is with us, Margaret Walsh, OAM, Tom Simonson, who is with us, John Watkins, AO, Mary Pattersos, Mike Baird, Grant Corduroy, John McCallum, Janine Walker, and Think Forward's lead economist, Thomas Walker. And the task force will also include strong union representation to ensure the views of workers are heard. We have listened to the sector, the workers and the people about what care they want and how this could be achieved. And we are not taking a patch and paint approach to this process. We have heard directly from workers their ideas to make lives easier with different models of care. We have heard from providers that current arrangements can stifle innovation. We need co-design, support at home and policy settings to be that allow innovative models to be viable investments. This is about the government investing in the care that older Australians actually want, and they want to be at home. This is about delivering a needs-based arrangement that makes financial sense. The task force will help our seismic shifts from provider-focused to person-focused and from funding-focused to care-focused. This new piece of work is the next chapter after 12 months of triaging an absolute crisis. This new piece of work is only possible now the results tell us that what we are doing is working. This new piece of work forms part of our capacity to face the future with ambition for aged care. In my first 12 months, I visited 35 aged care facilities across Australia. From Perth to Palmerston, from the Territory to Tasmania, I met hundreds of residents, I met hundreds of staff. I heard great stories of care done well. I heard of the gaps, the struggles, and the efforts unrewarded. And too many of them were the same stories that I heard on the wings, pushing the tray trolleys almost 20 years ago. I've talked you through a lot of policy settings today, but I wanted to finish with why this is so important to me. I wish I could have told a 19-year-old Anika scraping dishes in that nursing home kitchen on the weekend that one day she would come here as a minister to make an address about aged care reform. And I'm rueful that I did not have to look those residents like Peg and Dot in the eyes, knowing that it would be another 19 years before the standards in aged care would begin to lift in the way that they deserved then. And I wish I could tell all the women that I've worked with, like Nia and Sharon, that their stories would eventually become my talisman through 12 months of triaging a crisis. One of those women I was able to bring here with me today. My mum Deb, who worked in aged care for 15 years before she retired, a few with me alongside her. There were good days, there were awful days. And every day, Mum reminds me, they were short of staff. That's right. Nearly 20 years ago, when Mum was doing the rosters in the nursing home, workforce shortages were the biggest issue. And today, I think we can all join Mum in our frustration that workforce shortages are the biggest issue. This has always been a complex and slow-moving area of public policy. But Mum, her co-workers and her residents never had a Prime Minister and a government that brought ambition for aged care. Ambition decades in the making and in the waiting. Ambition born of necessity. The aged care crisis we inherited truly required a year of urgent triage. And 12 months on, we are tracking tangible, substantial progress. We are bringing aged care back from the brink, and it's about damn time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Minister, for that address. We've got a table full of journalists with plenty of questions to come, but I thought I would kick off with the picture that you're painting here of the new Act coming in with the rights-based authority to set standards and so forth. You've also referred to, I guess, the pressure on the system and the baby boomers. Now, some people watching this at home might think that this is a signal that says the new law will come into place in order to deal with the influx of more people in aged care. We're going to have to rethink how it's funded, and that may mean that householders are going to have to carry more of the financial cost when they get ready for aged care. What's your message to people watching at home who'll be thinking, OK, does this mean that I need to save more for aged care and fund more of my own aged care?
Thank you, David. I think my message to those people would be that my guiding principle in coming to chair this task force is that what we want for Australians about to enter the system, is better care and better clarity. It is a Byzantine system. People tell me they find it almost impenetrable to navigate. People are now paying consultants fees of thousands of dollars to help them navigate the system. What we want to do is look at that system and answer a couple of questions. You know, the recommendations of the Royal Commission, those proposals, but also just from the sector, how do we get more money into a system crying out for more money? So there are a lot of proposals out there, and the idea of the task force is that we will stand up, we'll meet within the next month, and we'll meet monthly until October, where we'll hand down our interim report, and in December we'll hand the final report to the government for consideration. And that will hopefully deal with this quite quickly, minimise any kind of concern. We're going to be open and transparent about it, and then government can make decisions off those recommendations for next year's budget process.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Sarah Ison.
Sarah Ison from The Australian. Just on those figures you mentioned about those improved figures from that, 66% to the 54% running at a loss, there is the point being made that those improved figures are bolstered by the new government funding that has flowed through from October, and the mandate to have that staffing mandate isn't until next October. So do you expect those losses to keep going down, given that when that mandate comes in, it might, nullify that? Do you have any concerns?
No, because come 1 July, the IHACPA rate goes up to 17%. So there's more money flowing through the system. Like the point I made, that the indexation rate under the last budget of the Morrison government, they gave the sector 1.7% to address rising costs. We are giving the sector 17% on 1 July to address rising costs. So there's a lot more money flowing into the system, and all of that has been factored and considered by IHACPA. And I think the sector, I dare say, would agree with me when I suggest that they have a long time waited for this to be decided by an independent body and not by the whims and political priorities of the government of the day. So we set up the independent authority, we've taken their advice, and that means come 1 July, 17% indexation increase.
Are you concerned about the number of facilities closing? We did see a figure before a couple of weeks ago about 23 having closed.
Look, I think closures have come under scrutiny in recent weeks. The fact of the matter is that we've had 76 facilities close in the past 2 years, 40 under the last year of the Morrison government, and 36 under our first year in government. I would suggest that the 40 that closed under the last year of the Morrison government were not closing because they had a crystal ball and could foresee the reforms that the Albanese government have brought in. It is a fact that this has always been a dynamic environment where facilities open and close depending on the needs of the market. And of the 76 that have closed in the past 2 years, I think it's 50 of them that have closed because the facilities no longer meet the needs of the residents. You know, this is, in some cases, I think about 65% of cases, but in some cases, this is a consolidation exercise where a company might have, say, 9 facilities and they close 2 or 3 down to 6 or 7 facilities because their oldest facilities are those cinder block, 4-bed wards that no one wants to live in anymore. And that's fair enough. So for us to move forward and lift the standard of care, what we need is policy settings that give courage and confidence to people that want to invest. And I think there are green shoots about that.
Thank you.
Next question is from Phil Curry.
Thanks, Corey. Hi, Minister. Phil Curry from the AFR. Could
Hello, Phil.
I ask you a double banger, which they're sort of related? You've outlined just in the previous answer a fairly short time frame to come up with a solution, if you like, December. Given the Royal Commission spent a lot longer than that and couldn't come to an agreed position, are you confident, or how confident are you of getting a consensus out of your task force? And second to that, the Royal Commission, one Commissioner, Mr Pagoni, he proposed an income tax increase or a Medicare increase, either of which would be hypothecated towards aged care. Ms Briggs, who you referred to earlier, she suggested just a levy, but not hypothecated, because she said that would amount to a tax on frailty, I think was her words. Either of those tax options or any other tax option in your thinking, or does it got to be more structural in that you're looking towards going towards means testing, rather than just raising more revenue, or could it be a combination of both?
Yeah. To the first part of your question, I'm not worried about it. I think we need to do this quickly because it informs so much else of what we're doing. I talked about the new Act, I talked about the new support at home regime. It is likely that both of those things, which are huge pieces of work, a new Act comes along once every 30 years, need to be informed by the recommendations of the task force. I think that, like you say, the Commission operated across 2 years' worth of witnesses. I think it was 641 witnesses. These are things that have long been called for by the sector. There are existing proposals, there was 22 reports into aged care and how to fund and fix aged care before the Royal Commission came along. Like, the evidence is there. What was missing was any kind of political will to actually sort it out. So that's what you have now. You've got the task force that we will, stand up within the month, meet monthly, have an interim report to government by October and have a final report by December. And that will keep this reform process chugging along, because as much as that might seem quick to some, I know many people in this room have worked in aged care sector, have been waiting for this for decades, and they can't see it come fast enough.
Just your views on the tax option?
Oh, sure. Well, I think I'm bringing, as the chair, an open mind to the task force and the deliberations of the task force. I would have thought that recommendations from the 2 commissioners would be something for the task force to consider. I think we should keep as many options open and the task force should work through them.
Thank you.
Because you're the chair of the task force, will it be your role to really sum up the consensus of that group? I mean, unless they're going to, as members of the task force, have a voting system to decide in terms of what the recommendations are. Will you see it as your role to sum up that consensus so you'll have a big say in what the outcome will be?
Well, we will, as a task force, and I know Nigel Ray will be my deputy chair, provide a final report of recommendations to government. Ultimately, this will be a decision of government. It is for, hopefully, the task force to provide what I'm hoping we'll be able to provide is a clear set of recommendations for government to adopt.
Okay. Next question is from Claire Armstrong.
Hi, Claire.
Thanks, Minister. Claire Armstrong from News Corp. You mentioned at the end of your speech that this is a government that's ambitious about aged care, but you yourself have conceded that the July 1 deadline for 24/7 staff nursing in aged care homes is not going to be met by everyone. There was a report by UTS last week that estimated only about 9.8% of the residential homes they surveyed would have enough staff to meet the 3 incoming standards. They estimated about 12.5 extra full-time equivalent staff are basically needed between now and October. Obviously, ambition is a good thing, but it looks like the government and the facilities is not going to meet that ambitious target that you've set for staffing. So when do you expect the majority of aged care homes to have those staff, and where will they come from?
Yeah, and I think, like I said in my speech, I'm happy to wear heat every single day for trying really hard to a higher standard for aged care than to be someone who skirts around the outskirts, just trying to avoid scrutiny, trying to avoid neglect. I think that's been something that has been tried and failed in the past. So, like I've said at length about workforce shortages being the biggest issue in the sector, we have pulled an awful lot of levers in the first 12 months. We've got 100 reform projects underway. Some of these levers to address workforce have never been done in federation. Like an $11.3 billion pay rise. Actually, Claire, I have for you, hot off the presses, so hot I had to print and run. SEEK has given me numbers saying that there has been a 30% increase in applications per job ad for aged care nursing this year, and a 35% increase in applications per job ad for aged and disability support worker roles this year. That speaks to more people listening to what we're saying, trusting us that we're trying to lift the standard and coming to the sector. That alongside something like labour agreements being a tripartite agreement between government, business and the unions, could never have been done under the former government. And the very first one over in Perth has secured an extra 559 workers just for one facility. And I know Minister Giles has people queuing out the door to try and get labour agreements secured for their patch. So I think that it's going to take a while. I've said it's going to take a while for this to wash through the system. I accept that we are thousands short, but I'm just going to keep my shoulder to the wheel and keep pulling all the levers until we get there. This isn't a 1 July overrun. The boat doesn't leave the harbour on 1 July and that's it, and everyone left on the pontoon is done for. I'll keep trying on the 2nd of July and every day after that until we get it done.
I guess my question is more though, do you have a sense, a timeline of when? Because obviously there are elderly people who would like to have that care and as much as they might appreciate the ambition, would also like a more realistic timeline.
The timeline is as soon as possible. We know that the vast majority of facilities are going to make it by 1 July. So we are actively, we've got the department calling facilities who we identified might be at risk of not meeting it to work through with them how we do it. And we'll just keep doing that until we get there.
Next question is from Josh Butler.
Hi, Minister. Josh Butler from The Guardian. You mentioned the tragedy in Cooma. Now, obviously mindful of ongoing investigations in this case, but at a recent Senate estimates hearing, the Age Discrimination Commissioner raised some concerns about that, whether police should be the fallback option or the fallback response when these sort of incidents do occur. Could I ask you, in a very general sense, what would you say to that? Should police be one of the first responders when there are cases like this? You talked about new, responses to dementia, people with dementia and aged care. And I guess more broadly, what update, if any, can you give on the aged care regulator's investigation into this matter?
Sure. Well, firstly, let's acknowledge the Aged Care Commissioner who is here with us. That is Janet's investigation that's on foot. She keeps me up to date with it as much as is appropriate, and I can't speak before it wraps up. Like I said in my speech, in terms of what I can control, I'm looking at everything that I can control. That we've got a quality standard that means all workers will need to be trained in what should be the core business of aged care. I consider working with people with dementia core business of aged care. We've got the opportunity for the National Dementia Action Strategy or Action Plan that we are developing this year to fold in whatever sort of learnings and agreements can be done out of, an awful thing that happened. I think it also falls for Mark Butler and I, who work together on dementia, to work with our state counterparts about what can be done. But as I said in my speech, 54% of people in aged care have dementia. This is something that we need to be a lot more proactive about. And I think that training all workers who interact with people with dementia, I'm sure that Marie McCabe would be, wherever she is, would agree with me, is a good place to start.
Next question is from Chantal Al-Khoury.
Minister, I just wanted to clarify a few points. Are you open to some older Australians paying for aged care if they have large assets? And just clarifying also that you're not ruling out considering a levy on taxpayers to help pay for aged care.
I think those are both proposals that have been considered in the Royal Commission recommendations, and that is for the Aged Care Task Force to now consider.
So you don't have any ideas of what you want to do?
It's not that I don't have ideas, it's that I don't want to preempt the task force. I'm not here to announce the outcomes of the task force today. I'm here to announce the terms of reference for the task force today. And we'll get going and we'll be open and transparent about it.
And just in terms of the standard that you hold for yourself in this area, as you mentioned, there are people in aged care that think of it with fear, not comfort.
Yes.
And you're saying that more boomers are going to be entering into this system. What's the benchmark that you're holding for yourself in that area with these findings?
I want to lift the standard of care in this country, and I want to do it in a way that is tangible for people. I still do. I've done 26 mobile offices in my electorate of Lilly this year as the aged care minister, and even though it's a local mobile office, I go suburb by suburb. 3/4 of the people that come to talk to me about aged care. So I have the benefit of getting to do this work at the highest levels of government, and then on a Saturday morning here outside the IGA, whether anyone feels like it's seeping through. And that's the measure that I hold myself accountable to, what the people of Lilly say to me.
Just to follow up on that, at a base level in the discussion, do we have to accept that the federal government just simply doesn't have the resources to do all the funding, and there have to be other mechanisms? Now, clearly, there's an open debate about whether a levy is another mechanism, but is it right for us to take out of this address today that the federal government can't do all the spending and other mechanisms must be found in order to fund the system?
I think, based on everything we know about what people have told us about where the system's fallen short for them to date and where baby boomers want the system to be, and if you look at innovative, excellent models of care around the world, you have to say that if we're not prepared to accept that cinder block, linoleum, 4-bedroom anymore, then we need to work out how we're going to pay for it. And plenty of people have said, I am prepared to pay for an innovative, excellent model of care. I just can't find it. So what we need, I think, from a federal perspective is, how can I write policy settings that give investment confidence to invest in these things? And if you look at some of the leading models, I'm thinking of Korongi down in Tasmania that had Hester invest. I've talked to them both about what was it that brought you two together, and what would you like from me to make that the case that kind of excellent facility is available to everybody across the country and not just a one-off.
Okay. Next question is from Bina Brown.
Hello. Bina Brown. Are you surprised, just I've got a bit of a double whammy too, are you surprised that there are so many consultants popping up to help navigate this system? That's the first one. And the second one is, you mentioned that the viability of some of the places that have closed is because they've no longer met residents' needs, yet most of those homes would have been accredited by the Aged Care Quality Commission. And so is the Aged Care Quality Aged Care Commission still the way to go going forward in accrediting these places? Are they doing their job properly?
Well, the first one, am I surprised by the rise of consultants in aged care? No, I find the system very difficult to navigate, and that's what, when I say I go to Zilmere and Sandgate, that's what people tell me. I have been taken back, well, it was my first few months, but the number of people I got calls from who said, oh, I'm really sorry that I'm calling you as the minister, but I feel like my mum's fallen through the cracks, can you help me? And when we get into it, it's that they haven't even applied to the right place. The system is that difficult to enter, and that's just not a sustainable way of operating when we know that the trend is on and there are going to be more people who need some form of aged care than ever before. It's a Byzantine scheme, like I say that by design. So no, I'm not surprised by it, but I want to do something about it. And this task force and the terms of reference of the task force, this is complex, difficult, politically difficult as well work that governments have shied away from for decades, and we are doing it, and we're going to do it quickly in a way that people will experience quickly, and I think that's a good thing. And what was the second part of your question? I forgot.
The Aged Care Quality Commission, are they doing their job if they're accrediting homes that are closing?
Oh, I mean, that stat that I rattled off earlier, 65% of aged care closures in the past 2 years were facilities that no longer cater to the needs of old people, that meet modern quality standards. So that's, I think, what I would say by way of modern quality standards is what kind of quality of life a person wants entering residential aged care, which may be distinct from the standards that the Commissioner and her team audit and police over at the Commission. But what I hear from people is that there are innovative models out there, but they find the Australian regulatory environment as such that there's really no incentive to do it, apart from doing it out of the goodness of your heart. So I hope that the task force is able to find what incentives there are for that kind of investment to come to Australia.
Thank you.
Thanks. The next question is from Maeve Bannister.
Hello, Maeve.
Maeve Bannister from the Australian Associated Press. Thanks, Minister, for your speech. Just following on from Joshua's question about the tragic incident in Cooma, you mentioned those new aged care quality standards. Do you see those standards as including any regulatory reform in terms of the way aged care staff respond to those dementia-related behavioural disturbances, to reduce instances where police are needing to be called or residents are sent to hospital, for example?
It's difficult to speak to the specifics of this without precluding the live investigation. There's 3 investigations on foot in that story. So to speak generally, the quality standards are currently being piloted. I think that pilot is due to finish in June. Quality standards are about what kind of standards you can expect as a resident in aged care. So the idea that anyone that you interact with, your workers, your personal carers, would be trained in dementia. It's more about the standards that you could expect as a resident than a regulatory scheme. It is monitored and enforced, I guess, by our regulator.
Thank you.
The next question is from Melissa Code.
Hi, Minister. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. I have sort of 2 branches to my question. So the big structural vision reform agenda that you've just outlined for us speaks to political impetus. It also speaks to the policy levers that you described, and also the legislative reform and funding. My first question is about that funding issue. Of the $34 billion a year approximately which is spent on aged care in Australia, that makes up about 1.2% of GDP, which is less than the OECD average of 2.5%. Is there something in your roadmap which speaks to being comparable to other similar economies in terms of GDP spend for aged care in Australia? That's my first question, so I might let you answer that.
I mean, it's not really a reckoner for me. I think, it's a $34 billion annual bucket, but we just had a $36 billion aged care injection into the bucket in the budget that's not even 4 weeks old. We're sort of in a period where I feel we're acting urgently to address 9 years of neglect. And whilst I have a huge amount of goodwill and support from the Prime Minister to do this. Like David said, we are not in an environment where the Australian economy and Australian taxpayers can continue to tip this money in indefinitely. And the sector has made very clear that there are alternative ways, alternative options that we could be looking at. There's just never been a government with the political will to do that, and we are that government.
So my other part of my question is shifting from that crisis status that you described to a more sustainable, viable, high-quality sector which will serve ageing millennials like you and I when we get older, if we live that long. That requires designing policy and drafting legislation well. And so when you talk about putting your shoulder to the wheel and pulling every policy lever possible in this breakneck speed of reform that you want to see happen, how do you make sure that the people drafting the legislation have the adequate time to implement and translate the advice of the task force according to the timeline you've set out?
Well, I'd point to the fact that we've made decisions that we advised at budget to move back the start of support at home in the new Act in order to do this strategically and sequentially. Like, we've got to sort the task force, the recommendations first. That will inform the new Act, that will inform support at home. And when I came to the job as the new minister, the overwhelming feedback that I got from all areas, from consumer groups, from provider groups, from workforce, was that the draft versions of support at home in particular, but the new Act also, about the statement of rights, that shift from provider focus to person focus, that shift from funding focus to care focus, wasn't there. So we've pushed it back to address that and to co-design. Everybody wants to co-design this. We did not have time to do that if we were to keep the previous deadline. So the idea is that this is really strategically thought out. We've been thinking about this for a year and we're now in a period where we are rolling it out.
The next question is from Natalie Vikrov.
Hi, Minister.
Hi, Natalie.
Hi, Natalie Vikrov from the Canberra Times. I have a question for you in your capacity as a Sports Minister. So it's on the Canberra Stadium facilities. Earlier, Finance Minister Katie Gallagher has previously said there would be no funding for a new stadium venue in Canberra in the budget. She cited a lack of a business case from the ACT as the main reason. Can you confirm that the federal government has money earmarked for a new stadium, and where would the government want it to be?
Look, great question. This is a question for about 4 ministers. For example, I don't look after sport infrastructure as the sports minister. I look after people in sport. Catherine King, as the infrastructure minister, looks after buildings in sport. So my part in this is as the steward of the AIS, and the AIS, I would say, is a big part of the broader consideration that you're talking about this patch in Canberra. So, like you say, it is under live discussion with all parties concerned. We should do it once and we should do it well. And I look forward to continuing to work with Minister Gallagher, Minister King, alongside Chief Minister Barr, to resolve this. But I can't resolve it for you today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next question is from Yusuf Saudi.
Hello, yes, I'm Yusuf from SBS World News. Just again on sport, actually. Today it was announced the PGA will merge its operations with LIV Golf, with Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund forming one of the largest shareholders. Now, this is a country that's had long-standing human rights concerns linked to the murder of journalists like Jamal Khashoggi. Both tournaments have deals to play golf events in Australia. Do you hold concerns that those international events in Australia will now be bankrolled by a country with a poor human rights profile?
Look, like you say, it's a story that's been breaking today while I've been absolutely up to my armpits in aged care, on the aged care side of the portfolio. So I would just say, like, I'm very interested by developments, but it is a matter for PGA and LIV Golf to resolve. It sounds like there's a long way to go from the little that I've understood in the news this morning. So I don't think I'm in a position to comment on that today.
Do you hold just any concerns about the rise of sports washing more broadly?
Getting into big questions now, Youssef. I would say similar to when I went to Qatar because Australia was hosting the World Cup next and we needed to go and take that handover. The position of the Albanese government on matters like this and how they come into my portfolio is that we take our seat at the table and that we have a view on these things and we deliver that view. So I went to Qatar and I had difficult meetings with Qatari ministers about where we wanted to see further improvement. And I will continue to do that as my practice as sports minister where it's called for.
All right, thank you.
So just a quick follow-up on that. Some people argue that sport and politics don't mix.
Yes.
But sport and politics do mix. Do you think there's a moral dimension there where politics and sport must mix?
Sport is almost more political than politics. I think that the only people who argue that sport and politics should not mix are the people that currently hold the political power in sport and seek to retain that political power. I saw that former Prime Minister Morrison teed off about this in the Parliament last week, about sports supporting The Voice. This from a man who created a group chat called Legends and, dragooned Australian athletes into this group chat to then say that the sport and politics should never mix. Please.
Okay. Thank you for a direct answer on that one. I appreciated that. Now, our next question is from Nick Stewart.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but one of the members of your task force, Bruce Baird, is in fact a former Liberal Premier. I was wondering if this is an attempt to get some sort of genuine outlook for the future that will reach across the parliamentary bench, and if so, if you are looking for a long-term approach, what will be the eventual relationship between the NDIS and aged care? Will your task force be looking at that sort of issue as well?
Quick fact check, Bruce Baird was Liberal Minister, State Liberal Minister, but...
Yeah, it's Mike Baird on my task force, whom I welcome, who has been doing really great work at Hammond Care. Hammond Care are particularly good and leading in the space of dementia. And I welcome his agreement to come on the task force. I think the thrust of your question doesn't sit within the terms of reference of the aged care task force, but the spirit of your question, I think, is captured by the fact that the Albanese government care economy draft strategy is now out for consultation. It's one of the first things that I identified alongside Ministers Shorten and Keogh and Rishworth, that we were all dealing with very similar issues of the care economy, like workforce constraints, like supply, like fraud, but we were dealing with them in silos. That's just how the federal government was set up to operate. So we're now working together to see how we can align and bring those kind of things together. And certainly, I think there are opportunities for us to do more across the whole care economy, and there's more to come.
So there could be some sort of joint future for NDIS and aged care that will flow from one into another?
I think it's far too soon for me to say that, but I do say that I work very closely with Minister Shorten about the issues that we have that seep across both portfolios.
Thank you. Our next question is from Andrew Tillett.
Hello, Andrew.
Hello, how are you going? Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review and board member here at the club. Going back to sport in politics, and I'll probably be accused of inflaming a culture war, but this is not the intention of my question.
Is it about Origin?
No. Lifelong New South Welshman, I've given up. But the trans athletes in sports continues to be a vexed issue for sports bodies around the world. We've seen situations where recently a professional cyclist in the US has announced she retired because she was being beaten by trans athletes. On the flip side, the World Athletics Body has recently said, no, we're not going to allow transgender athletes to compete against... We've even seen something like in parkrun, which I know you're familiar with, is also as a parkrunner like me in the UK, where the women's record is now being held by a trans athlete, and that's caused some consternation there, even at sort of where you're basically competing for bragging rights, essentially. What exactly is the role in government in helping navigate this issue, given that it's a sensitive topic? Sport throughout the years has had a record for inclusiveness and things like that. Whereabouts should we be looking at this as a society?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that how I can play a positive role here as a steward, as someone who runs the sport ecosystem, is to look at the things that I can do as Sports Minister that can't be done elsewhere. So for me, that's working with the AIS, who works with all of our national sporting organisations about developing guidelines and a framework that makes sport as safe and inclusive and participatory for everyone. That's my guiding principle. Obviously, like you say, within each sport and each national sporting organisation and the world governing body that they report to, there are nuances about this that they work through. But my hope is, within Australia, we, under the banner of the AIS or Australia's sporting system, we can have guidelines that set out what our principles are and the expectations that we have of everyone, from under fives up to our elite athletes, to make sure that sport is safe and inclusive.
Do you think it's a situation where, like, it'll eventually get to the point where the professionals' codes will have to ban trans athletes? Because it seems, as a sports fan here, it seems the issue is that it only becomes a problem when the trans athlete starts winning. You know, like, if we can be inclusive, but if they start winning, that's when people start going, well, that raises these questions about fairness and participation.
I don't think it's helpful for me to draw broad conclusions about that, because it comes down to the nuances of each individual sport and what is required and what winning looks like. But I would point to, in terms of my ethos and how I approach this as the Australian Sports Minister, is that our new high performance strategy that we launched at the end of last year is called Winning Well, and how there have been instances and scandals in Australian sport over recent years where the win-at-all-costs mentality has trumped a sense of fair play or equality or inclusion or fairness. And what we want, both myself and Josephine and Kieran, who run the AIS, to see is, above all else, we win well. And if we don't win well, that isn't winning.
Thank you.
So, broadly speaking, is it, in your view, better if the government is not making the decision here for the codes, that it's up to the codes to manage their own arrangements themselves, rather than have a government decision as such? You've got guidelines, but that's not really a decision that forces anything on anybody.
Yeah, and the Australian Institute of Sport is funded entirely by the Australian government. It sits as an arm that runs and deals every single day with the nuances of NSOs. And Kieran Perkins started as CEO only a month or two before I started in this role. And you probably remember last year he came out really strongly about this and sort of set the tone for how we want to see this addressed in Australia.
Okay, thank you. Last question is from Phil Curry.
Big finish, Phil.
I've been asked again. I could ask you how to fix the Carlton Football Club, but that'd be harder.
Let's get into it.
Harder than
Let's get into it.
So, no, in your capacity as you're a rare species in the Parliament insofar as you're a federal Labor MP from Queensland. There's only 5 of you in a state of 30 seats, and you've only got 3 senators, I think, out of 12. With the resignation of Mark McGowan, Queensland's now going to become more important than ever at the next election. The orthodoxy was before the last election, if you didn't pick up seats in Queensland, you wouldn't form government. WA helped you circumvent that. What's the plan for Labor? It's the one nut you can't crack as a party up there. You're trying to take seats back from the Greens in inner city Brisbane, and you've got outside of the southeast, it's largely Conservative. What does Labor have to do to take a handful of seats for the LNP at the next election and keep majority government?
Yeah, I think we're well on our way to doing that this term. I think I've been running around regional Queensland as much as possible in both aged care and sport capacities, and was just in Mackay on the weekend, and the cabbie was telling me that he really thinks the new PM seems like a normal bloke that he wouldn't mind having a beer with compared to the previous one, and that is real feedback. And I think, like, not to dwell on the Lilly result, but we can have a 9.9% swing in one term. Queenslanders, I think, maybe wary on approach, gauge you and then back you in hard. And I think that the kinds of issues that we're focusing on as a federal government, having Jim as the Treasurer, having Murray as Agriculture and Emergency Services, flood recovery and emergency recovery is such a big issue in Queensland. And to have Murray Watt doing that, having myself as Aged Care Minister, incredibly important from a regional services perspective, I think are all part of an approach out of government that works towards 2032. The PM has never been backwards about the fact that he picked a Queensland woman to be the Sports Minister and the Vice President of the Olympics Committee. And everything I do in the sports portfolio has an eye on the green and gold runway towards 2032. And that is a massive deal for Queensland.
Thank you.
So on that note, the Greens should be a bit careful in the seat of Griffith in Brisbane.
They certainly should.
On that note, please join me in thanking Anika Wells for speaking here today and her address. Before you go, I have our gift here to thank you for your address. It's membership of the club, because you are welcome back here at any time. We hope to hear from you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.